Hi, fantasy readers. This is Karyne Norton, your fellow book binger, and you are listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where you can test out a new fantasy story every single week to find your next favorite author. We're back again with part 2 of Shoes of Red by Celeste Baxendell, so if you missed last week's episode, you'll want to go back and listen to that one first. If you haven't figured it out by now, Shoes of Red is a fairy tale retelling, although I'll admit I did not know this one was by Hans Christian Andersen, who I'm obligated to like because of my Danish heritage. But Celeste has an entire series of retellings called Bewitching Fairy Tales, so if you're enjoying this story, you'll want to check out the rest of the series. Stick around to the end, or check out today's show notes to see where you can find more from the author. For now, please enjoy Shoes of Red, Part 2, by Celeste Baxendell. Chapter 5. The scholar and Gothel decided to extend their stay indefinitely, and Karyne didn't know whether to be furious or relieved. It hadn't taken her long to figure out exactly what the scholar wanted her to do. He wanted her to break from the exhaustion and come crawling to him, begging him to remove the curse. In exchange, he'd get the shoes and a sick sense of satisfaction. Why he wanted them so badly, she had no idea. But this was a matter of pride. She said he was getting those shoes over her dead body, and she meant it. She'd rather die than go back to living in poverty, or worse, get arrested. While magic wasn't outlawed, Castia had a strict set of laws, established centuries ago regarding its use. Using magic to deceive was a highly punishable offense, one that could land her in prison for several years, if not the rest of her life. Some were more sticklers for the laws regarding magic than others. Karyne didn't see the problem. The shoes gave her talent, and the fact she was a fraud didn't bother her at all. She was simply using the resources she had to get ahead. It's not like she stole them or hurt anyone. She paid for them, fairly. Now, she was paying for them in a different way. She spent most of her days sleeping, trying to rest her constantly aching muscles. Fortunately, she didn't need to practice with the musicians as much as she used to. They had plenty of songs she'd already danced to. She had the musicians go back to them for her performances, but she did have to come up with something new, or else the king and queen would have questions. If Karyne was going to be forced to dance to the awful cacophony in her head, she was going to try to make the best of it. Some nights she spent the hours swearing and cursing the day she saw the red shoes, and others she directed her anger towards the scholar. Why did he have to come to Castia? Maybe, Karyne hoped, that similar to how the spell only lasted from midnight to dawn, maybe it would fade over time. Maybe she just had to outlast the scholar. When she wasn't sleeping, she tried to keep herself distracted. She worked her way through the book of poems Florian gave her, and when she finished it, she read them again. After that, she went through, found her favorites, and dusted off the simple desk in her room that hadn't been used in months. She propped her aching feet up and practiced her old calligraphy skills by making copies of her favorite poems, so she could hold on to them when she returned to the book. The burning need in her gut for validation eased. It also fought off the nausea and dread that crept up on her the second the sun set. She kept away from all court gatherings she didn't perform at, and when she did perform, she left immediately after. If the scholar ever came looking, he wouldn't find her. One night, minutes before their performance, Kurt mentioned the princes were planning to stop by afterwards to ask after her. Karyne still left before they had the chance to appear. The scholar's eyes always followed her with a calculating flare from where he sat so high above her in the balcony. She always schooled her face into a neutral expression. While her limbs weighed on her and she was ready to crash at any moment, she wasn't going to let him know his plan was working. 2 weeks went by, and every night was the same as the last. She danced to a hideous melody only she could hear, from midnight until dawn. The magic showed no signs of fading. The scholar had also kept his distance as well, but showed no signs of leaving. Karyne knew she couldn't keep going on like this indefinitely. Every day her muscles ached deeper, and her eyelids grew heavier. "Karyne, are you coming down with something?" Kurt asked after Karen's third yawn as she started warming up with a few stretches before their rehearsal. The handful of musicians behind him stared at the stage floor, holding their instruments carefully. "No, of course not." Karyne stretched her arms up. "I'm sure the court will understand if you need a few days off to rest," Kurt said. The 2 harpists behind him nodded in agreement, and Karyne wasn't fooled. They obviously just wanted to cut rehearsal short. Kurt hadn't gotten his position and held it for over 20 years by demanding anything less than perfection. "I'm sure they would, if I were actually sick," Karyne said, pushing herself off the ground. Her calves ached, and she forced herself to ignore it. "But I am not, and they are expecting a new dance, so we shall rehearse." Kurt mumbled under his breath, but gestured at his musicians to get into position. The first few notes hit the air, and Karen's magical, amazing, cursed shoes took over. While the shoes knew exactly what to do, Karyne needed to at least pretend like there was some kind of process she was in control of. Every so often she would pause, have them back up a few measures, and repeat them until she considered the section right. More often it was Kurt who stopped the musicians and had them back up as they worked to perfect their parts as well. They were halfway through the composition, and Karen's legs were on fire. Knowing she was going to end up in that awful ballroom later that night to dance for hours nearly made her scream. But she did not. She continued to let the shoes lead her, burying the fire raging under her skin. When the backstage doors flew open and a trumpeter blasted a grating off-key screech in shock, Karyne dropped to the ground and looked over her shoulder. Some of her hair spilled out in her loose bun at the motion. Her heart turned to lead, and she buried her shaking hands in her rehearsal skirts. "Oh, please don't mind us," the scholar said in the doorway. Gothel hovered at his side, while Prince Lucian and Prince Florian walked in around them. "I'm so sorry to intrude, Kurt, but our guests have been so impressed with your and Karen's work, I offered to bring them by your rehearsal, so they could peek behind the curtain. I hope it's not a problem," Prince Lucian said. Kurt gave the prince an affectionate, fatherly glare. "You could have sent a note. You gave my poor trumpeter a heart attack, and Karyne nearly broke her ankle." The scholar tilted his head at that. "It was spur of the moment," Lucian said, unbothered by Kurt's rebuke as the group approached. Karyne climbed to her feet, taking deep breaths and hoping her face didn't betray the torrent of terror and fury in her. She twisted her hands deeper into her skirts and curtsied. "We're more than happy to have you drop by, Your Highness." Prince Florian trailed behind the group as the scholar took the lead with Prince Lucian. Florian opened his mouth, but he closed it and looked down without saying anything. "So, mind if we watch for a few minutes?" Lucian turned to Kurt. "Yes, I believe strongly in the idea that one can learn from a vast array of sources, and apply it to one's own work," the scholar said. He turned to Karyne, and his awful, slimy smile appeared. "I'm certain a master such as yourself will have a lot to teach me." Karyne gritted her teeth as Kurt sighed. "I suppose if you must, but please do not interrupt." Karyne turned her back on the group and moved back to her place, waiting for the musicians to compose themselves. She heard a few heated whispers between Gothel and the scholar, but she had no idea what they said, nor did she care. If this was some kind of intimidation tactic, it wasn't going to work. She was not afraid of them. She wasn't. If only she could believe it herself. The notes hit the air, and she lost herself in the music. Every so often, she caught snatches of whispered conversation, mostly Lucian speaking to Florian. Florian never responded, at least not that she could tell, as she spun around the stage in a furious fashion. Any time she got close enough to hear, Florian ducked his head, and Lucian covered his smirk with his hand. She did her best to avoid looking at the scholar and Gothel, but when she was unfortunate enough to lock eyes with them, the scholar's gaze sent a shiver down her spine, while Gothel stared at the ground with a pensive scowl. Actually, no. Karyne lifted her chin and danced faster. He was not going to win. Not this time. She would not be cowed, not by some sadistic two-bit wizard and his witch. When the music came to a triumphant close, Karyne leaped through the air, spinning on her toes and sending her skirts whipping around her until she came to an abrupt stop, a hair in front of the scholar. Everyone else in the room stared at them, waiting for one of them to move. Her skirts settled at her side, close enough to brush against his legs. She smirked up at him, steadying her breath as he leaned back. "Did you enjoy the performance, scholar?" He narrowed his eyes. "Yes, watching you has been quite edifying." "Scholar," Gothel said, reaching for his arm. She tried to pull him a step back, but he remained in place. Karyne sunk her burning feet into the floorboards and clenched her fists. His breath, hot and suffocating, hit her. She was not going to move first. "Well then, consider it my highest honor to have provided such value to a well-educated man like yourself." "I look forward to seeing the full performance later," Lucian said, stepping in between them and flashing an easy grin at both of them. "Thank you for letting us watch." Karyne reluctantly stepped back at the same time the scholar did. She swept into a curtsy. "You're very welcome, Your Highness." As she straightened back up, she caught Prince Florian's gaze. His eyes flickered between Karyne and the scholar, and a frown formed on his face. He opened his mouth and managed to say, We should go." "Right you are," Lucian said, clapping his brother on the back. "We've monopolized enough of their time." The group headed towards the doors, and Karyne unclenched her fists. The scholar glanced over his shoulder, raising an eyebrow. She could practically hear his voice asking, how much longer would she last? Once they were gone, Kurt muttered under his breath about royal pains. Karen's legs shook, and she sunk to the ground, unable to bear her weight any longer. Her skirts fanned out, and her hair fell completely loose, tangling around her shoulders. Kurt's voice buzzed around her, asking if she was all right, but she waved him off. How was she going to get out of this? Chapter 6. After the scholar and the princes dropped in on her rehearsal, Karyne dragged herself to her room to rest her legs until the shrieking notes forced her up. She let her mind go, unable to bear the weight of her thoughts. Instead, she let the pain in the arch of her feet and searing muscles dominate every terrible second. If she thought for even a second, despair would rush over her. How was she going to get out of this? She didn't know the first thing about magic. She might as well have been a rag doll, letting the shoes lead around her limp and lifeless limbs. Her rehearsal skirts whirled around her as she hadn't bothered changing. Sweat pooled on her brow. The faint moonlight arced through the sky. Her hair whipped through the air in a loose braid she knew was going to fall out before dawn came. She danced, and it was agony. The moon moved through the sky. Its light filtered through the large windows and lit up the polished floors. When a door creaked, she cracked an eye open to see Florian, again in his loose nightclothes, hovering at the edge of the room. "You might as well come in, Your Highness," Karyne said, forcing her hands into her skirts for a curtsy. Apparently, Prince Florian had a penchant for pre-dawn strolls. She hoped he'd stop passing by her ballroom. "Aren't you, you already rehearsed today?" Florian said as he made his way across the floor. "With the musicians? Is it a crime for me to rehearse on my own?" Karyne asked. I suppose not," Florian said, wringing his hands together. Aren't your legs sore?" "Is it not noble to suffer for one's art?" Karyne asked as the moon finished setting. Dawn was seconds away. I guess," Florian said, glancing at the floor. As her movements slowed, she knew she needed to keep him focused on anything other than the fact this was the second time he caught her acting strangely. She stepped up to him, steadying her breath and smiling. "I wanted to thank you for the poetry book." His head shot up, and a light entered his gaze. Oh, you're welcome. Do you like them?" "Yes, so far my favorite is the one about death." Karyne nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. A little morbid, but true. "Really? I thought it was, bittersweet," Florian said, fiddling with his sleeves. "It is, but it was a nice sentiment." Karyne took a deep breath. Should she? The words fell out of her mouth before her better senses could stop her. "It would have been nice to read it at my mother's funeral." All the color left Florian's face. I had no idea. I'm so sorry." "Thank you, but what's past is past. I've made my peace with it." Karen's heart warmed for the first time since that windy, desolate day. "Still, well, if you've finished the poems, or, want something else to read, the library is open to anyone in the castle," Florian said. The library. The Royal Library is a wealth of information, isn't it? Karyne forced the interest out of her voice and replaced it with a casual air. Yes. Florian's lips twitched into a smile. "We've got a wide array of books on subjects of every kind." She was willing to bet that included magic. "I'll have to visit sometime. Thank you, Your Highness," Karyne said, dipping into a curtsy before leaving in the light of the dawn. Florian watched her go, and she hesitated at the door, waiting for him to say whatever it was he so clearly wanted to. He tore his gaze away and swallowed. Whatever it was, he wasn't going to speak. Karyne turned her head, pushing Florian's presence out of her mind, and a grin spread over her face. The scholar might think he had her right where he wanted, but he was so very wrong. Despite Karen's aching feet, one night a few days after she spoke to Florian, Once her performance was done and well before midnight, she made her way to the Royal Library. In one hand, she clutched the poetry book Florian lent her as her excuse for visiting. She had no idea how long the scholar's reach was. Better safe than sorry. Before she focused on her task, Karyne took in the library. Candles flickered, lighting up the shelves and covering the room in an orange glow, highlighting the bright, warm wooden shelves and tables. The bookshelves stretched so far back that Karyne couldn't see where they ended. She'd never seen so many books before, and her breath hitched. Her mother would have adored the sight, and Karyne had to admit it wasn't the worst thing to look at day after day. Before, she hadn't really understood why Florian, a prince with a whole castle, a whole city at his disposal, favored books above all other pastimes. But looking at the Castian library, Karyne started to understand. There was only one librarian inside. She was an older woman with weathered skin and wrinkles, standing at the desk in the front. Karyne walked up to her and set the book on the counter. Prince Florian borrowed this book, I believe. I'm just here to return it. You're the dancer, aren't you? Karyne, is it? The librarian asked as she reached for the book. Karyne hoped that would be true for a long time. Yes, I am. The librarian's gaze landed on Karen's auburn hair as she flicked the book open. That's what I thought. What did she mean by that? The librarian frowned. I believe there's a mistake here. This isn't the library's copy. This is Prince Florian's personal copy. He'd given her his own copy? Why in the world would he do that? A loose page peeked out, and the librarian pulled it out of the pages. Oh. Karyne thought she'd gotten all the little calligraphy copies she'd made. She must have missed one. Did you make this? The librarian held up the poem. At Karen's slow nod, the librarian beamed. It's beautiful. The princes never took to calligraphy. Prince Lucian never had the patience, and Prince Florian did well enough when no one was looking. But any time he thought someone was watching, his hands shook terribly. Not surprising, given what she knew about the two princes. Thank you. My mother taught me. She always favored more artful things over practical skills. Karyne fought to keep the bitter, grieved edge out of her voice. Like dancing, I can only assume, the librarian said, setting the sheet down. But I would argue there's nothing more practical than maintaining knowledge. You know, if you ever tire of dance, I could use a scribe. Before Karyne got the shoes, that would have been her dream, being surrounded by books of the highest quality. How short-sighted. But why should she sit in a dusty old library copying letter after letter, when she could be center stage? I will keep it in mind, Karyne said, knowing she would do no such thing. That's all I can ask, the librarian said. If you like, I can hold on to this book and return it to His Highness. He normally stops by once a day. Perfect. She wouldn't even have to see him. I would greatly appreciate that. Thank you. Feel free to take a look around. I won't close up for an hour or two. We have more poetry in the center right section. The librarian gestured. Thank you. Do you have any books on magic? Karyne glanced over her shoulder. Magic? Curious about our visitors, I assume? The librarian asked, raising an eyebrow. I'm told they're quite powerful, and magic is something of a mystery to me. Well, those books, the few we have, would be in the back left, the librarian said. Karyne disappeared into the shelves, moving as quickly as her sore legs would let her. Her eyes skimmed over the bookcases, searching for any titles that might be useful. Once she pulled down a few, she sunk to the floor and nearly cried in relief at getting off her feet. Her skirts crushed beneath her as she tucked her legs under them and spread the books out around her. She worked through the books slowly. What caused her the most delay was how she had to start at the very beginning. She didn't know much about magic other than the fact it existed, and her shoes had magic in them. Well, she also knew Castia's laws about magic were complex, and she knew she was most certainly breaking them. After a few minutes of reading and jumping between books, she started to form a better, very basic understanding. There were 3 basic types of human magic users, 2 of which she knew about: sorcerers, who didn't matter to her; enchanters, the type that made her shoes; and wizards and witches, the scholar and Gothel, respectively. Karyne had gotten halfway through an explanation of how wizards and witches used incantations when she heard voices towards the front of the library. "She's here? You mean, right now?" Prince Florian, of course. For someone who was a notorious wallflower, he seemed to be everywhere. Well, everywhere she was. "Yes, she has been for a while now. She's back in the magic section," the librarian said. Karyne closed the books spread around her and started to gather them up. She had an armful of books and was about to start the arduous task of getting her legs under her when Prince Florian stumbled into her aisle. Well, how did she make this less suspicious? "You'll have to forgive me for not curtsying, Your Highness." Karyne raised an eyebrow as he hovered at the end of the aisle. He blinked, and then a small laugh bubbled out of him. It was a surprisingly nice sound. Really, Karyne didn't understand what anyone saw in Prince Lucian when Florian was right there. Why didn't any of the noblewomen talk about how his laugh could chase a storm away? He reached out and said, "Here, let me help you with those." Lady Bianca had to be an utter fool to choose Lucian. Before she could come up with a reason to refuse, he'd taken the books from her. His eyes flickered over the titles. "This is a lot of, heavy theoretical reading. A far cry from poetry." Karyne shifted her legs under her. Normally, she would have abhorred wrinkling her expensive skirts, but her exhaustion combined with Florian's laugh washed such a feeling away. She grinned up at him. "What can I say, Your Highness? My tastes vary wildly." He set the stack of books on a cart at the end of the aisle before turning around and reaching a hand out to her. As she took it, he helped her to her feet. He didn't let go once she was up as he said, I thought you were too busy to read." "I made time," Karyne said, pulling her hand out of his. "And if—" Florian swallowed thickly, taking his time with each word. "If I ask, if this is about why you look so exhausted and spend every night dancing for hours, would you tell me what's going on?" Apparently, he was sharper than she gave him credit for. Karyne stepped back, lifting her chin. "Have you been spying on me, Your Highness?" His eyes widened as horror shot through them, and he raised his hands in front of him. No, I didn't spy on you. I just noticed, that's all." "Your concern is appreciated, but unnecessary." Karyne straightened up. Her feet ached instantly. "You—" Florian frowned and looked down. His gaze landed on the red shoes peeking out from under her skirts. It has to do with your shoes, doesn't it? If anyone found out she was a fraud, especially a prince, her life was over. She needed distance. She shifted her skirts so they covered her feet. I'm afraid you're mistaken. No, you. Every night you dance in those shoes. I know those are your performance shoes. Florian narrowed his eyes. If you were actually rehearsing for hours on end, you'd wear rehearsal shoes, like you wear rehearsal skirts. They're different pairs. They just look identical, Your Highness. Karyne curtsied. If you'll excuse me, I must get going. She tried to duck around him, but he caught her arm. He didn't look at her, and his voice was soft. Please, Karyne, I just want to help. She pulled her arm out of his loose grip and hurried away. This was something she would have to figure out on her own. The truth about her could never see the light of day. Whatever dark magic the scholar used on her, she'd figure out how to get rid of it alone. Chapter 7. Karyne kept going back to the library, and it irked her to no end that 9 times out of 10, Prince Florian was there. Not only was he always in the library, he just had to be in the section on magic, reading away as though he had no idea what he was doing. For someone so clumsy and tongue-tied, he was awfully devious. Well, he could read all he wanted, but he wasn't getting any information from her. She continued her own education, focusing on what little information there was about wizards. Their magic was incantation-based. Unfortunately for Karyne, the language could only be understood by those with magic. So even if she managed to remember the gibberish the scholar spoke that awful night, she'd never be able to transcribe it or translate it. It didn't matter how much determination she had. She didn't have a chance at breaking the curse. Only someone with magic could help her, and that was exactly what the scholar wanted. Karyne had slammed the book shut and rushed out of the library despite her sore muscles screaming in protest. She was fast enough that Prince Florian couldn't catch her even if he tried. And when she made it to her room, she took a shuddering breath and sobbed. It was the first time she'd cried since her mother's death. There was no way this ended where she wasn't exposed to the court as a fraud. She was going to lose everything. Terrible memories crept up on her. Her knees slammed into the ground as her hands sunk into her sides. Dirt scraped against her bare feet. Wind cut through her moth-eaten, threadbare clothes. Her stomach gnawed and rolled in its emptiness. Part of her hoped the king and queen decided to arrest her when the truth came out. At least she'd have a roof over her head and something small to eat. Castia wasn't cruel to their prisoners, at least not that she knew of. Even so, as she stared down the only 2 paths open to her, she refused to cut her losses. The scholar wanted her to break. If Karyne wasn't going to get what she wanted, then neither would he. She would go on for as long as she could, and hope that when the dust settled, there would be something of a life left for her to live. That evening, she took center stage in front of the court. Her limbs weighed her down. She had done her best to cover the dark circles under her eyes and bring color back to her sallow skin, but it wasn't very effective. The scholar tapped his fingers on his armrest, grinning down at her from the balcony's lofty heights. Somehow, even someone as awful as him was above her, like everyone else. Karyne was always lower, always worth less, never enough. So much so, the only thing she was beloved for was a lie. It hadn't bothered her once, but as the scholar stared down at her, as she remembered the wistful look in Florian's eyes when he looked at Lady Bianca, it did. Karyne would never be satisfied. It was never enough because she was never enough. She hardened her heart and stared right back up at the balcony. Fraud or not, she still had a dance to perform. At the scholar's side, Gothel swallowed and looked down, brushing her palms on her skirt. The scholar leaned forward in his seat, as if daring her to do it. Karyne lifted her chin. She would not be cowed into fear. The first notes filtered into the air. She avoided Prince Florian's worried gaze and the way his knuckles whitened, gripping his seat. Even if she could swallow her pride and tell him the truth, he'd never want to help her after knowing it. And if by some miracle he did, he had no magic, so there was nothing he could do. She wasn't his problem, no matter how beautiful his laugh or how bright his smile. So she danced. She let her mind go blank, and the shoes did their job. Note after note, step after step, time crawled by. The dance might have been new, but Karyne didn't have to actually learn the steps. Then, as she reached the climax of the song, a whisper, nearly drowned out by the crescendo of the instruments, hit her ears. A strange language she could never hope to know. She had just leaped into the air, and when she landed, her legs fell out from under her. A terrible crack echoed in the room as she slammed into the ground with far more force than she thought possible. Pain ripped through her, and she couldn't stop the scream in her throat. The room dissolved into a flurry of motion and chaos. Karyne kept her head down, curling in on herself as the pain overtook every other sense. Footsteps stormed over the stage. Someone was at her side, gently touching her shoulder. "Karyne, the physician is on his way. Just hold on. Take deep breaths." Was that Florian? A hand found hers and slid into her grip. She crushed it in her own, and each second the burning pain increased. Someone else knelt nearby and started giving orders, but Karen's mind was too hazy to understand. Arms wrapped around her, turning her over. The pain increased tenfold, and she screamed, kicking out with her other leg. The new voice said something, and the only thing she heard was something about sedation. She thrashed again as the arms around her tightened, forcing her to still. Something cold, glass maybe, pressed against her lips, and her mouth was forced open. The liquid filled her mouth, and she coughed and choked it down. In seconds, the world went black. Pain was the first thing Karyne noticed when she woke up. But what else was new? She groaned and forced her eyes open. A few candles illuminated the room. What time was it? She didn't hear the terrible melody, but it had to be close. "How do you feel?" Karyne shot up, instantly regretting the motion as a fresh wave of pain washed over her. She hissed and sunk back down. When her vision cleared, she spotted Prince Florian sitting by her bedside. No one else was in the room. "Are you allowed to be in here?" Karyne blinked in the dim candlelight. If you want to kick me out," Florian started. "No." Karyne frowned. She grabbed her head, waiting for the ache to clear for a moment. "I mean, isn't it considered improper for you to be in here with me, alone?" Oh, no one knows I'm here." Florian stared at his hands. sort of snuck back in. Did he have any other hobbies? Or was she just the most interesting? If we're being frank, then, Your Highness, I feel awful. So can we skip to the part where you tell me why you're here? I'm I'm hoping you might be a little more inclined to answer my questions. He glanced over his shoulder and lowered his voice, even though there was no one else around to hear him. Starting with why I just had to bribe the physician to keep quiet about the fact you have a pair of shoes that are impossible to remove. He did his best to set your ankle, but it certainly made it more difficult. Karyne glanced down at where her ankle was wrapped and propped up on a pillow. The bright red color of her shoes practically mocked her. Maybe he just didn't try hard enough. She just needed to act natural, and maybe Florian would doubt himself. Are are you still insisting on this? Florian sputtered. Fine. If those shoes are perfectly normal, then take them off yourself. Maybe in the morning. It's awfully late. I should get some rest, Karyne said, faking a yawn. She laid back down. Would you put out those candles as you go, Your Highness? Florian gaped at her, pacing the floor for a moment before stopping and staring at her. The things he didn't say were the loudest. As she closed her eyes, she heard a mumbled agreement. She breathed a little easier when she heard the door shut behind him. He knew something was going on. Karyne couldn't keep the truth hidden much longer. What would she tell him? At least she frustrated him enough that she bought herself a few hours. If she wasn't dead before the night was over. The first few screeching notes entered her head, and she nearly threw up. Her body moved without instruction. She hobbled across the room, obeying the magic, but trying to keep off her broken ankle. When she stumbled into the hallway and put weight on her bad ankle, pain ripped up her leg. This was going to be agony. Tears rolled down her face as she made it to the ballroom. As much as she desperately wished to, there was no stopping the magic. So she danced. Her ankle screeched in protest every second of it, and more often than not, her vision swam right before she collapsed on the floor from pain. Each fall was only a respite for a matter of seconds before the angry notes pounded in her head, forcing her arms under her and back to her feet. The moon moved through the sky, and Karyne begged the dawn to come, but the night remained despite her desperate pleading. Dancing on broken glass had to be less painful, or maybe even hot coals. It couldn't be as awful as this. She fell every other step, searing agony overtaking her senses. Each time she tried to sink her nails into the marble, desperate to stay down, but the notes screeched in her ears. A force stronger than her willpower made her get back up. Karyne couldn't stop the frustrated shriek that turned into a desperate sob. She couldn't go on. What are you doing? Chapter 8. It was over. As the magic forced Karyne back to her feet, she spotted Prince Florian in the doorway to the ballroom. He shot into action, rushing across the polished floor towards her. Karyne couldn't get a word out as her feet kept moving, and pain took the air out of her lungs. Your ankle is broken. You are going to cripple yourself. You need to get off it right now, Florian said, lunging for her arm. But the screeching melody moved her out of his range. The words fell out of her mouth. I can't stop. He lunged again, grabbing her arms and pulling her to the floor. His grip was like iron. It's It's the shoes, isn't it? They're making you dance yourself to death. When had she become so weak? But she nodded anyway, unable to stop the tears spilling over her cheeks. The notes continued shrieking, and her limbs kept trying to move. Her voice shook, and she'd never sounded so broken. Please help me. I can't. This is agony. Instantly, he turned her, pressing her back to his front, wrapping his arms around her front and pinning her arms down. He wrapped his legs around her as well, using them to pin her own. The notes grew louder, beating at her head. Her arms and legs pushed back against Florian, but after weeks of exhaustion, not even the magic was strong enough to throw him off her. Thankfully. I want to help you, but you have to tell me everything, Florian said, resting his head on her shoulder. After a few shuddering breaths, she managed to say, There's nothing you can do. Why don't you let me be the judge of that? Florian asked. There was no avoiding it. Either way, she would be exposed as a fraud. She might as well get it over with. You're partially right. It is the shoes, but it's more than that. The shoes have always been magic. Karyne sighed. What? All my talent, it's fake. I bought the shoes to make me the most talented dancer in Castia. When I don't have them on, I'm no more of a dancer than any random person on the street. Karyne shook as the notes continued pounding and shrieking. I'm a fraud. What? Why? Florian's palms pressed into her sleeves. My mother died, and there were debts to pay. I was out on the streets with next to nothing to my name, and I heard the palace was looking for a new entertainer. Then, like magic, I saw the shoes, and when the merchant told me they were enchanted, I saw everything I wanted in an instant. So I spent all I had left to get these shoes, but I knew it would be worth it. And in a matter of weeks, I was here in the palace, and people loved me. Her head fell forward, and she struggled to breathe. These last few months have been... I'm beloved by the whole court. I have nicer clothes than I ever dreamed of wearing. I don't go hungry. I can't lose this. But she knew she already had. Is it worth killing yourself over? Florian asked. Do you really value undeserved praise and riches over your own life? You wouldn't understand. You've never gone hungry a day in your life. Karyne bit back, twisting in his ironclad grip. The pounding in her head loosened her tongue. Venom and exhaustion coated her words. Have you ever wanted anything that's out of your reach? He didn't respond, but his breath hitched against her back. She wished she could see his face. She sniffed. Everything was perfect until the scholar arrived. I don't know how, but I think he came because of me, or rather, the shoes. I told him the only way he'd get them was if I was dead, and then he used some kind of terrible magic. After that, the shoes refused to come off, and every night since I have danced from midnight to dawn, with no reprieve. It's only going to stop if I beg him for mercy. The scholar is not a man who knows the meaning of the word. That much is clear. Anger flooded Florian's voice. You've already angered him. So even if I go to him, you think he'll let this keep going on until this kills me? Karyne asked, struggling against the nausea rising in her throat. Florian nodded, and she felt his skin brush against hers. The notes in her head started to fade, Light broke the horizon in the windows. She sunk back into him. There's no hope, then. No, that's not. There has to be a solution. I certainly don't have magic, and you certainly don't have magic. That's the only way out of this, Karyne said. The scholar is the only option. Maybe. But that doesn't mean he has to know about it, Florian said. Maybe there's something in his room we could use as leverage. She turned in his arms, wincing at the pain shooting up her leg. Why are you helping me? Why do you care? Do you remember that first night when I stumbled across you in this ballroom? Florian asked, his hands sliding down her arms. At her nod, he took a deep breath. You thought I kept approaching you because I was trying to practice. But I wasn't. He wasn't. Oh. That made a lot more sense than him being in love with Lady Bianca. I'm sorry, Karyne said, pulling out of his grip. I'm not who you thought I was. I don't care if you can dance or not. That's not why I love you, Florian said. Love? Did he really love her? Everything you know about me is a lie. I'm a fraud, and I'm vain, and greedy, and I'm nothing. I love you because you're strong and determined, and confident. You're not nothing. You're the most amazing person I've ever met. And even when I can barely get 2 words out because I'm terrified I'll make an idiot of myself, you don't even bat an eye. Florian sat back. You make me want to talk. No one, not even my brother, makes me feel that. That's not enough. You're a prince, and you're good. You're so good and kind and thoughtful, and you deserve someone who deserves you. Someone with the right status, and someone who's honest and as good as you are. Karyne shook her head, failing to blink past the tears swimming in her eyes. Her breathing came out labored and stilted. I've never been enough. I'm not enough. Listen to me. I don't care about status, or all the things you think you aren't. Florian's arms caught hers, and his gaze pierced hers, burning brighter than the sun. You are enough. You always have been. She had no idea who moved first. Probably her. But in the next few seconds, all she knew was that they were kissing, and she forgot about the pain in her ankle. She sunk her hands into his hair, and he wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her closer. Warmth flooded her. The world shifted in his arms. The burning need to be seen, to be adored, faded. Hearing those words, that finally she didn't have to pretend to be something else, that someone saw her beneath the show and wasn't disappointed. Hearing that she was enough, for the first time in a long time, Karyne was satisfied. She'd thought for so long that the best feeling in the world was being loved by a crowd, but she had no idea how inferior it was to being loved by one person, by the right person. The way he'd looked at her, had he always looked at her with such awe? How had she missed it? When had she started looking at him the same way? When she pulled back, she kept her eyes shut and breathed deeply. All right, let's get these awful shoes off my feet. He laughed in her arms, and she really liked that sound. Florian tried to convince her to let him handle it, but that was never going to happen. This was Karen's mess. She was going to be there, broken ankle or not. It took some arguing, but eventually they came up with a plan. So, after digging up an old wood staff she could use as a crutch, they made their way to the wing the scholar and Gothel were set up in. Florian assured her they were going to be in a meeting with Lucian, discussing Castia's magical imports. Lucian wasn't capable of keeping a meeting short, and Florian managed to get his hands on a skeleton key. She hobbled behind him, moving as fast as she could and ignoring Florian's worried glances at her. Relief washed over her when they reached the scholar's room, and Florian unlocked it, reaching behind him and helping her inside. She took a deep breath. "What are we looking for?" "The scholar is a meticulous man. I'm willing to bet he keeps diligent records, especially of any spells he's used. That's the first step," Florian said, shutting the door. "If not, then we look for anything we can blackmail him with. Anything illegal or damaging." Karyne hobbled forward, catching herself on the desk and sitting down. Florian joined her in an instant, and they started rifling through the drawers. They pulled out journal after journal, paper after paper, but none of them mentioned Karyne or the shoes. They were all observations about Castia, which would be concerning if they didn't have a bigger objective at hand. Florian got up and started searching around the room as Karyne slowly climbed to her feet after him. He rifled through drawers and tore the room apart so quickly, Karyne had no idea what to do with herself. He knelt by the bed and peered under it. His eyes lit up. "What is it?" Karyne dropped to the floor beside him, abandoning her crutch. He pulled out a notebook. This has to be it." Karyne snatched it from his hands and tore it open, but before she could read anything, a door slammed behind them. Chapter 9. The notebook fell from Karen's hands as a cold, feminine voice said, "Dare I ask what you two think you're doing?" Gothel stood in the doorway. Karyne tried to shift her position, but her ankle throbbed in response. Florian shot to his feet, stepping in front of her. "You." Florian glanced back at Karyne, and she nodded. He could do this. She knew he could. He turned back. "You know why we're here." Gothel crossed her arms and looked past Florian to Karyne. "It's an admirable effort, trying to find something in here that might help you, but it was never going to work." What do you mean?" Florian asked. "There's no record of Karyne, her shoes, or what the scholar's done. You won't be able to prove anything should you try, and you won't be able to stop this." Gothel walked into the room. "I'll give up the shoes," Karyne said, using the bed to pull herself to her feet. "Please, I just want this to be over." Florian quickly reached behind him, and she took his arm, leaning on him. "This only ends when the scholar is satisfied, and since you challenged him, he'll only be satisfied when you're dead," Gothel said. "That's not happening." Florian's grip on Karen's arm tightened. "Are you both so twisted that you want her dead for refusing you?" Gothel frowned, and Karyne remembered. That awful night, Gothel tried to dissuade the scholar. Maybe there was a chance. Karyne was tired of pride and vanity and fighting. She hobbled forward and stared into Gothel's eyes, hoping her words could move the mountain in them. "Please, I know you don't want me dead. I'm willing to give up the shoes. Please, just let me live." The witch pinched her face and let out a long sigh. "I'll regret it in the morning, but you're right. I don't want you dead. And the sooner we have the shoes, the sooner we can leave." Sit down." Karen's eyes watered as she managed to get out a soft, "Thank you." "Just sit down before I change my mind," Gothel huffed. Florian helped Karen get to a chair, and she wiped at her eyes. This was going to be over, and the sooner she never saw those awful red shoes, the better. "Unfortunately, because the shoes are cursed, I can't do anything about that. But I can at least get them off you by modifying it a little," Gothel said, kneeling in front of Karen. Florian rested his hands on Karen's shoulders, and she reached up, squeezing his hands in hers. What, what is so special about these shoes?" Florian asked, as Karen stretched her feet out past the edges of her skirt. "They're red." Gothel grabbed Karen's left foot and shot Florian a cold look. "Now, be quiet if you want me to do this." Karen winced at the sharp pain rushing up her leg, but didn't make a sound. She just tightened her grip. Gothel started an incantation. The strange words filled the room, and the pressure on Karen's feet eased. As soon as Gothel stopped speaking, the shoes fell off, clattering to the ground. Karen slumped back into the chair, staring at the shoes. They laid there as though they had never caused her any grief at all. Was it really over? Gothel scooped the shoes up off the floor and held them up. "I suggest the two of you lie low over the next couple of days, until the scholar and I leave." "What are you going to do with them?" Now that Karen could breathe again, she couldn't help but wonder what the scholar and Gothel wanted with such a specific object. They didn't strike her as wanting to be the most accomplished dancers in the kingdom. "Study them," Gothel said, as though it were obvious. "Why, what did you mean you said, because they're red?" Florian asked. "Do you not even know who created these shoes?" Gothel gaped at the two of them. At Karen's shrug, she scoffed. "The Red Enchanter made these. We have no idea who they are, but we're going to find them, even if we have to do it piece by piece." Karen pushed herself up, and Florian quickly got her crutch for her. He said, "Whoever they are, they're not in Castia. Otherwise, my family would know." "That's cute you think that." Gothel rolled her eyes and pointed towards the door. "Now, get out." Karen didn't need to be told twice. She and Florian hurried out, and she reveled in the feeling of bare feet against cold stone. It was over. She was free. As soon as they made it out of that wing, she threw her arms around Florian and buried her head in his shoulder. "I can't believe it worked. I'm free." Florian's arms wrapped around her, and he lifted her into the air, spinning her around and laughing. "It worked." Karen laughed as she pulled back. "I thought it was over when Gothel walked in. That was a miracle." He leaned in and kissed her, and she pulled him closer. Her hands sunk into his collar as he held her waist, and he slowly put her down. Pain ripped up her leg, forcing her to pull back and take her weight off it. She hissed as Florian studied her. He stumbled over his words as he said, I'm sorry." "Don't be." She shook her head with a grin. It was worth it. She kissed him again. So worth it. Because of the night Karen spent dancing on a broken ankle, it would never really be the same. To put it simply, she'd never be able to dance again. The court was devastated. Karen was relieved. She and Florian thought it would be best to let that part of her life die. It wouldn't be pretty if the court did find out she was a fraud. Karen and Florian both wanted her to stay around, and if the truth came out, There was a sense of relief knowing Karyne would never be asked to perform again. Of course, if she couldn't perform, how was she going to stay? The Castian royal family was generous, and that was without Florian having to step in. The king and queen were allowing her to stay as long as she needed while recovering. She worried at first about what Florian's family would have to say about his attachment to her, but when Prince Lucian dropped by with a kind voice and teasing smirk, her worries eased. Lucian assured her he and his parents certainly didn't care about the circumstances of her birth. They were just relieved someone had gotten through Florian's shell. Besides, Lucian was already set to marry well, and Florian had always wanted to pull away from the watchful, judging eyes of the court. Lucian told her Florian was lucky to have her. Karyne assured the crown prince it was the other way around. Karyne kept herself busy while on bed rest. Just because the royal family wasn't going to ship her away to keep her and Florian apart didn't mean she didn't need to figure out some kind of plan for when she recovered. Florian visited often and assured her she wouldn't have to go anywhere. He would find a way to keep her around. When he wasn't there, she read and practiced her calligraphy. The scholar and Gothel left a few days after they had the shoes. She hadn't seen either of them again before they left, much to her relief. If she never encountered any kind of magic for the rest of her life, she'd consider it a life well lived. As she was approaching the end of her forced bed rest, she wondered what was next. That was, at least, until Florian walked into her room with an armful of books for her. She shot up in her bed. "That's it." "What is?" Florian blinked at her. "The librarian. She offered to take me on as an apprentice, to help her copy manuscripts." Karyne gestured to the loose papers, filled with poems on her desk. "That's what I can do to stay." "Is that what you want to do?" Florian asked. I've seen your calligraphy. It's amazing, but I don't want you to feel like you have to." "My mother, she taught me calligraphy. It's a skill I actually have, not one I have to fake. That's what I want." She nodded, and her eyes welled up. "I don't want fake applause anymore. I just want to do good work, even if only a handful of people appreciate it, or no one at all." "Then that sounds perfect," Florian said, sitting at her bedside. "I can't say I'll be too upset, seeing my favorite person in my favorite place." She laughed and leaned forward, catching his arm with her own. She stared at him. How had she gotten so lucky? "I love you," she said. She was satisfied. She didn't need the court or fancy things. There was nothing left for her to prove. Florian didn't care about status. Karyne was enough. He smiled, and they kissed. And after that kiss, they had their whole lives to spend together. Having each other was worth far more than the fleeting, shallow adoration of a crowd. Karyne couldn't be happier. I hope you enjoyed listening to Shoes of Red Part 2 by Celeste Baxendell, narrated by Karyne Norton. If you want to read more by Celeste, go to celestebaxendell.com to find more of her books. Don't forget to grab Trials of Feathers and Faith, a free prequel to her latest series. If you haven't left a review for the podcast yet, please click on the link in the show notes and take 30 seconds to get that done. You can even leave a simple star rating if you don't have time to write something. Every little bit helps to get people excited about trying out the show, which helps me find more authors to feature. Thank you all for listening, and happy reading.